I've always been the kind of person who shows up, no matter what, a flat tire at midnight, a crisis at work, a birthday nobody else remembered. I showed up. I thought that meant my family would do the same for me. I was wrong. My name is Layla. I'm 31 years old, and until about 18 months ago, I genuinely believed my family was close. Not perfect, no family is, but close. We had Sunday dinners at my parents' house every couple of weeks. We had a group chat that stayed active. My mom always said we were the kind of family that stuck together no matter what. I held on to that phrase like it meant something, like it was a promise. It wasn't. The fall everything changed started with a phone call from my gynecologist. I'd been having symptoms for months. Pain that came in waves, fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix, irregular cycles that my previous doctor had chalked up to stress. I'd switched doctors finally, and the new one actually listened. After an ultrasound and some additional imaging, she referred me to a specialist. The specialist found a large ovarian cyst with characteristics that needed to come out. Not immediately dangerous, she said, but not something to ignore either. She recommended surgery within the next 2 to 3 months. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after that appointment, just staring at the steering wheel. I wasn't panicked, I was just still. The kind of still that happens when reality lands on you all at once and your brain hasn't figured out how to process it yet. I called my mom first. She picked up on the second ring and I told her what the doctor said. There was a pause. Well, did she say it was cancer? I said no, they didn't think so, but they needed to remove it to be sure. Another pause. Okay, well, keep us posted. That was it, keep us posted. I called my husband next. He was calm and practical in the way he always is, which I needed. He asked questions, wrote things down, and that night he sat with me on the couch and held my hand while I cried a little. He was steady. He was there. His name is Owen, and I want to say that clearly before I say anything else, because he matters in this story too. The surgery was scheduled for mid-November. I had about 10 weeks to prepare, medically, logistically, emotionally. I told my parents in person the following Sunday at dinner. My dad, whose name is Gerald, nodded a lot and said things like you'll get through it, and modern medicine is incredible. My mom, whose name is Fern, asked if I was going to need to take time off work and seemed more focused on the logistics than on me. My younger brother, whose name is Andre, barely looked up from his phone. The only person who asked how I was actually feeling was my Uncle Noel. He's my dad's older brother, 72 years old, retired, lives about 20 minutes from my parents' house. He'd been at that dinner because he came to most of them. He pulled me aside after we ate while everyone else was in the living room watching football, and he said, "How are you holding up, sweetheart?" Not logistically. "How are you?" I almost cried right there in my mom's kitchen. I told him I was scared. I told him I kept thinking about what "just in case" meant when doctor said it. He listened to every word without interrupting, without pivoting to something more comfortable, without minimizing. Then he said, "I'll be there. Whatever day it is, as I'll be there." I believed him. And he was the only one I actually believed. Over the next few weeks, I watched my family's level of engagement with my situation hover somewhere between minimal and non-existent. My mom texted once to ask if I knew what anesthesia they were using. My dad called once, briefly, to see if Owen needed help with anything around the house. Andre texted a GIF. That was the sum total of their involvement. Meanwhile, I was navigating pre-op appointments, filling out advance directives, figuring out short-term disability paperwork through my job, and trying to keep my anxiety from swallowing me whole. Owen handled everything he could. Uncle Noel called twice a week, every week, without fail. Sometimes we talked for 20 minutes. Sometimes we talked for an hour. He'd been through his own health scares, a heart procedure about 8 years ago, and he knew what it felt like to lie awake at 3 in the morning, wondering if your body had betrayed you. In October, about 6 weeks before my surgery, my parents announced something at Sunday dinner. They were going on a cruise. Not a short one, a 14-day Caribbean cruise, departing the Monday before Thanksgiving and returning the Saturday after. It was a trip they'd been planning, apparently, for most of the year. My mom had found a deal through a travel club she'd joined, and they'd paid a deposit months ago. They were going with 2 other couples from their church, friends they'd known for decades. My dad was visibly excited in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. I looked across the table and did the math in my head. My surgery was scheduled for the Thursday of that same week, 4 days after their departure date. I said, "Mom, my surgery is that Thursday." She looked at me, then she looked at my dad, then she said, "Layla, we've had this plan since February. The deposit is non-refundable." I didn't say anything else at dinner. I didn't know what to say. I kept waiting for someone to follow up, for my dad to bring it up on the way to the car, for my mom to call the next morning, for something to indicate that this was at least a conversation worth having. That maybe they'd look into whether the deposit was actually non-refundable, or whether travel insurance covered something like this. Nothing. A week went by. Then another. I finally called my mom and asked her directly if she considered whether they should change their plans. She said, "Layla, it's not an emergency surgery. You said so yourself." I said, "I know, but it's still surgery. I'm going to be alone in a hospital." She said, "You have Owen." I said, "Owen has to work. He's taking days off, but he can't take 2 weeks off." She said, "You're going to be fine. You're young and healthy, and the doctors know what they're doing." I got off the phone and sat on the bathroom floor for about 15 minutes, not crying, exactly, just sitting. Uncle Noel called that evening, like he always did. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I already told you I'd be there. That hasn't changed." "You don't have to do this," I said. "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to." My surgery was on a Thursday morning in mid-November. Owen drove me to the hospital at 5:30 in the morning, waited through the pre-op, and had to leave for work around 9 because he'd used all his immediate leave and couldn't afford to lose the day's pay. He kissed my forehead in the pre-op bay and told me he'd be back before I was fully out of recovery. He kept his word. But in between, in those hours when they were prepping me and wheeling me back and I was lying there in that thin hospital gown counting ceiling tiles, it was Uncle Noel sitting in the chair next to my bed. He'd arrived at 6:15 in the morning. He brought coffee for himself and a small crossword puzzle book, and he sat there without making a big deal of it, without being dramatic, just present. Like it was the most natural thing in the world to be in a hospital waiting room before sunrise for someone who needed you. I remember reaching out and holding his hand before they took me back to the OR. I was trying not to shake. He squeezed my hand and said, "I'll be right here when you wake up." He was. I came out of anesthesia in the recovery room to the sound of machines and a nurse checking my IV, and when they moved me to a room about 40 minutes later, Uncle Noel was already there, sitting in the chair by the window. He didn't say much. He just handed me ice chips when I asked for them and turned the TV volume down when I fell asleep and was still there, reading a magazine, when I woke up again. My parents were somewhere between Puerto Rico and St. Thomas. That same afternoon my mom texted, "Hope surgery went well. Let us know how you're doing." I stared at that message for a long time. Hope surgery went well. Like I'd had a hair appointment. Owen came back that evening and stayed until visiting hours ended. Uncle Noel came back the next morning and stayed most of the day. I was discharged Saturday and Owen picked me up and got me home. Recovery from laparoscopic surgery is not nothing. I was sore, I was exhausted, I couldn't lift anything or drive for 2 weeks, and I had follow-up appointments and a pathology result pending that I was trying not to obsess over. My parents were extending their cruise by 3 days because the weather had been so beautiful. I found out about the extension through my mom's Facebook post. A photo of her and my dad at dinner on the ship, champagne glasses raised, with the caption, "Extended our stay. Paradise found. So grateful for this trip." 47 likes, 3 heart reactions, a comment from my Aunt Deb saying, "You two deserve every second of this." I put my phone face down on the couch and didn't pick it up for an hour. Uncle Noel came to the house every other day during those first 2 weeks. He brought groceries, practical things Owen and I actually needed. Milk and bread and the specific kind of soup I'd mentioned once that he must have written down. He sat with me while Owen was at work. He drove me to my first post-op appointment because Owen couldn't get away and I legally couldn't drive myself yet. In the waiting room, when the nurse called my name and I stood up too fast and got dizzy, it was Uncle Noel's arm I grabbed to steady myself. He didn't make it into a thing, he just steadied me. My parents came home the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, 17 days after my surgery. My mom called from the airport. She sounded tan, somehow if that's possible over the phone. She was full of stories about the excursion in Aruba and the food and the other couple they'd befriended on the ship. She asked, almost as an afterthought, how I was feeling. I said I was still recovering. I said the pathology had come back clear. No malignancy. And I said I'd had some complications with the incision site that required an extra appointment, but that it was under control. She said, "Oh, good. So everything worked out." She did not ask about the complication. She did not ask what under control meant. She moved on to asking whether Owen and I were coming to Thanksgiving at her house that Thursday, because she was planning the menu. I told her I'd let her know. I talked to Uncle Noel that night. I told him about the conversation. He listened, and when I was done, he said something I've thought about many times since then. He said, "Layla, I've been watching your family for a long time. I see things that you might not be able to see from the inside." He didn't say anything else about it. He just said, "I love you and I'm proud of how you handled all of this." I didn't understand what he meant yet, not Wolseley, but I would. We did go to Thanksgiving. I went because I didn't have the energy to not go. Fighting felt harder than showing up. Owen drove us, and I sat in the passenger seat feeling like I was bracing for something I couldn't name. Dinner was fine, on the surface. My mom made her usual spread. Turkey, 2 kinds of stuffing, the green bean casserole, sweet potato pie. Andre brought his girlfriend, whose name I've already forgotten. My dad was in a good mood, still riding the post-cruise high, talking about how they needed to do it again next year. Nobody asked about my recovery, not in any real way. My mom said, "You look good when I came in," which didn't mean anything because I'd gotten good at looking like I was okay when I wasn't. Andre never mentioned the surgery at all. My dad asked once, broadly, if I was back to normal, and when I said I was still healing, he nodded and changed the subject. My Uncle Noel sat across from me at the table, and at one point our eyes met and something passed between us. I don't know how to describe it exactly, just an understanding, like he was saying, "I see this, I'm not gonna pretend I don't." The months that followed were quiet in a way that felt hollow. The holidays came and went. My recovery continued. Owen and I talked more than once about what kind of relationship I wanted to have with my parents going forward, what I was willing to invest in, what I needed to protect myself from. I was in therapy by January, which helped me name some things I hadn't had language for before. The minimizing, the emotional unavailability, the way my needs had always been secondary in that family unless they were convenient. I was not the favored child. That had always been Andre. He was the one my parents bragged about, the one they adjusted for, the one whose problems became the family's problems. My problems were inconveniences. My accomplishments were acknowledged politely, and then moved past. I'd spent years telling myself I was imagining it, or that it wasn't that bad, or that family just operated this way sometimes. Therapy helped me stop telling myself those things. Uncle Noel and I talked about it too, slowly and carefully over many months. He didn't push. He'd share things occasionally. A memory from when we were kids. An observation, and I started to understand that he'd seen this dynamic my whole life. He'd watched it from the outside, from the position of the family member who was present but not inside the immediate unit, and he'd seen things clearly that I'd been too close to see. He had receipts too. That part came out gradually. He mentioned it for the first time in the spring, almost 6 months after my surgery. We were sitting on his back porch, and he said something about how he'd been keeping a record, not because he planned to do anything with it, but because he wanted to make sure he wasn't misremembering. He'd been worried, he said, that he was too close to being protective of me to be objective, so he'd started writing things down. Dates, things people said, things he'd observed. I didn't fully grasp what that meant until later. In July, my parents announced that they were throwing themselves a party, a combination retirement celebration and early anniversary dinner. My dad had officially retired in the spring, and their anniversary was in August. They booked a private room at a restaurant in the suburbs, a nice place, the kind with cloth napkins and a prix-fixe menu, and invited about 40 people, family, church friends, some of my dad's former colleagues. I was expected to attend. Of course I was. I went. Owen came with me. We sat at a round table near the back with Uncle Noel, and a few of my dad's cousins I didn't know well. The evening was elegant. There were toasts. There were photos displayed on a board near the entrance. Pictures of my parents through the years, their wedding, vacations, milestone moments. There was a picture of Andre at his college graduation. There was a picture of Andre at his first job. There were several pictures of Andre. There were 2 pictures of me. I'm not sure anyone else noticed. I noticed, I counted. I ate my dinner and smiled when I was supposed to smile and talked to the people around me, and tried not to let it land too hard. Owen noticed that I'd gone quiet, and he reached under the table and found my hand. After the main course, my dad gave a speech about gratitude and family. It was well delivered. He mentioned Andre by name 3 times, talked about how proud he was of the man Andre had become, mentioned a specific promotion Andre had recently gotten. He mentioned me once, briefly, in a list that included 2 of his cousins and his college roommate. I sat there and thought, this is who they are. This has always been who they are. And then Uncle Noel stood up. He hadn't told me he was going to do this. He'd asked the event coordinator earlier in the evening. I found out later whether there would be time for additional remarks, and she'd said yes, at the end of toasts. He'd been patient and quiet all evening, and when the moment came he stood up and picked up his glass. He started by saying how proud he was of his brother, my dad. and how much he loved this family. He said it warmly and he meant it, and the room was relaxed and smiling. He talked about what it had meant to him to be part of this family's life over the years, to watch the next generation grow up, and then he shifted. He said he wanted to share something because he believed that real love required honesty. He said he'd spent the past year watching something that he couldn't reconcile with the family being celebrated tonight. He said he wanted to do this not out of anger, but because he'd thought a long time about whether silence was the same as permission. He reached into his jacket pocket and took out a small notebook. The room had gone quiet in a different way now. Not relaxed quiet, attention quiet. He said, on November 14th, Layla had surgery. She'd been diagnosed 2 months before that, and she was frightened. She called her mother the day of the diagnosis. My mom made a small sound. My dad's face had gone still. Uncle Noel read from his notebook. He read the dates, when I'd told them, when my surgery was scheduled, when they'd left for the cruise. He talked about what he'd observed over those weeks, that I had gone to every pre-op appointment without a family member present except Owen, that I had called my mother 3 weeks before surgery and asked directly if she was going to reconsider the trip, and been told it wasn't an emergency. He mentioned the Facebook post about extending the cruise. He mentioned the Thanksgiving dinner at which nobody asked about my pathology results. He mentioned the party board with 2 pictures of me and 7 pictures of Andre. He had noted all of it, every date, every observed fact, recorded in that small notebook, with his deliberate, careful handwriting. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't emotional in a way that felt uncontrolled. He was measured, and that made it more devastating than shouting would have been. When he was done, he said, I love Gerald and Fern. I love this whole family. But Layla has been loved differently in this family than Andre has been loved. And I watched it happen in the clearest possible terms this past November. And I am not able to sit here tonight and toast to what a close family we are without saying that out loud. He sat down. The room was silent for about 5 seconds. Then my dad said loudly enough for the table to hear, Noel, that is completely out of line. And Uncle Noel said calmly, I know you think so. My mom was crying. Not the kind of crying that looks like guilt. The kind that looks like offense. Like someone who has been publicly embarrassed and can't believe it's happening. Andre was staring at the table. His girlfriend looked like she wanted to disappear. My dad's college roommate had found something very interesting to look at on the far wall. I sat completely still. Owen had my hand again. I don't know when he'd reached for it. He just had it. After a few moments of nothing, one of my dad's cousins, a woman named Paulette, who I'd always found a little intimidating, said quietly, Gerald, is any of that wrong? My dad didn't answer. Paulette said, because I remember calling the house in November to check on Layla, and Fern told me she was fine, and I thought that seemed fast. Nobody said anything. The event coordinator appeared at the edge of the room with a dessert cart, looking uncertain about whether to proceed. Someone waved her in, and the sound of plates being set down broke the silence into something more navigable. People started talking again, in lower voices, with a different energy than before. My parents didn't come over to our table. My mom went to the restroom and stayed for a while. My dad sat at the head table looking at the wall. At the end of the night, as people were getting their coats, I made my way over to Uncle Noel. I didn't have a speech prepared. I didn't know what to say. I put my arms around him, and he held on for a moment, and I said, You didn't have to do that. He pulled back and looked at me. Yes, I did, he said. You would have kept making excuses for them indefinitely. I know because I watched you do it for 30 years. He wasn't wrong. The weeks after the party were strange. My parents did not call me to apologize. They called me to express how upset they were about what Uncle Noel had done. My mom left a voicemail saying it had been humiliating, and that she couldn't believe her own brother-in-law had attacked them at their own celebration. My dad sent a text saying that he didn't think the way Uncle Noel had handled things was appropriate, which is a different thing than say Uncle Noel was wrong. I noticed the distinction. I did not call them back right away. I sat with it for a week, and then I talked to my therapist, and then I called my mom. I told her that I wasn't angry about the party. I told her I understood it had been uncomfortable. And then I told her that I had needed her last November, genuinely needed her, and she had not come. I told her that I had been afraid in that hospital, that I'd had a complication that scared me, that I had healed largely with the help of her husband's 72-year-old brother, while she was posting sunset photos from a cruise ship. I told her that I didn't say any of this to punish her. I said it because I needed her to understand that what Uncle Noel had said was not an attack. It was a description, she cried. She said she hadn't realized, She said she thought I was fine, that I always seemed fine, that I was so capable. I said, I was scared. I just didn't keep telling you after you stopped asking. It wasn't a resolution. It was a beginning of a different kind of honesty between us, or at least the possibility of one. My mom and I have been in a slow, careful process of figuring out what our relationship actually is and what it could become. It's not a fairy tale. There are no guarantees, but the performance is over. The version of our family that only existed in my mom's Sunday dinner stories, that version has been put down, and we're left with the real one, which is more complicated and also more honest. Andre hasn't mentioned any of it. That's not surprising. My dad and Uncle Noel haven't spoken much since the party. I know that bothers Uncle Noel more than he lets on. He didn't do what he did without knowing what it would cost him. I think about that a lot. About what it means to love someone enough to say the true thing. Knowing the true thing might make people angry. Knowing it might cost you the comfortable version of your relationship with your brother. He did it anyway, because he decided that my being invisible in my own family was not something he could keep being quiet about. The pathology was benign, by the way. I'm healthy. Owen and I have talked about trying to start a family of our own in the next few years. And when I think about the kind of home I want to build, and the kind of parent I want to be, I think about Uncle Noel sitting in that hospital chair at 6:15 in the morning with his crossword puzzle book. I think about what it looks like to actually show up, not in the group chat, not in the Sunday dinner performance, actually, physically, concretely when it counts. That's the version of family I intend to build. And I have a very good example of what it looks like.